She dressed ugly to test him on the first date, but he proved her wrong in the most passionate way. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome to Mr. Peter Stories. Before we begin, I want to say a beautiful prayer for my sweet Mr. Peter Stories family. May love and happiness always fill your hearts, and may you always find joy in the stories we share together. I appreciate every single one of you, and I pray that no matter where life takes you, you always know that you are loved and valued. How was the last story? I hope you enjoyed it. Yesterday I wasn't feeling well, and I want to be honest with you about why. Lately I've seen some of my loyal family members drifting away, attracted by other channels. It hurts, but I will never force anyone to stay. My stories come from my heart, and I create them with deep love and passion. But I want you to know something very important. I love you, truly. Every story I tell, every moment we share is for you, my beautiful family. And no matter what, I will continue pouring my heart into my stories, because those who truly belong here will always feel it. So today, let's begin with love. Let's dive into another intense, passionate, and unforgettable story together. Are you ready? Let's go. The soft glow of the dating app illuminated Charisse Deja's face as she sat cross-legged on her plush velvet couch, the Las Vegas skyline twinkling beyond her 20th floor apartment window. Her finger hovered over the send button, trembling slightly as doubt crept in like an unwelcome shadow. The message she'd crafted lay waiting, vulnerable and honest, unlike the carefully curated responses she usually sent to potential matches. The autumn wind whistled through the slight gap in her balcony door, carrying with it the distant sounds of the Strip, a constant reminder of the city where appearances meant everything. Charisse knew this truth intimately, had lived it every day since moving to Las Vegas 3 years ago to pursue her career as a digital artist. In a city of illusions and facades, genuine connections were as rare as rain in the desert. Her phone screen dimmed, a silent warning that she'd been frozen in this moment of indecision for too long. With a gentle tap, she brightened it again, Magnus Falcon's profile photo coming back into focus. His dark eyes seemed to look right through the screen, holding a depth that had first caught her attention among the sea of polished, superficial profiles. "You're being ridiculous," she whispered to herself, running her free hand through her thick, natural curls, hair she usually straightened for client meetings and first dates. The soft fabric of her oversized sweater provided little comfort as she read over Magnus's message for the 20th time. "Your gallery of digital art speaks volumes about how you see the world. Layers beneath layers, beauty in the overlooked spaces. I'd love to hear the story behind Shadows of Self, particularly the way you've woven traditional Nigerian patterns into modern architectural elements. It reminds me of my own struggles with cultural identity in my work as an architect." It wasn't just another generic "hey" or surface-level compliment about her profile pictures. Magnus had taken the time to find her professional portfolio, to really look at her work. The thought sent warmth spreading through her chest, even as her insecurities tried to douse it with cold reason. The walls of her apartment displayed the evidence of past disappointments, photographs of moments when she dared to hope, only to have that hope shattered by men who couldn't see past physical appearances. Her most recent piece hung prominently above her desk, a digital painting of a woman wearing multiple masks, each one peeling away to reveal another beneath. She'd titled it "Layers of Truth," and had poured her own experiences into every brushstroke. A notification banner slid down from the top of her screen, another message from Magnus. "I hope I haven't overwhelmed you with my analysis. Sometimes my architectural brain gets carried away seeing patterns and meanings. But there's something about your work that feels like a conversation I'd love to continue, if you're willing." Charisse felt her lips curve into a smile despite her reservations. His uncertainty was endearing, human. In a city where everyone wore confidence like designer labels, his genuine vulnerability stood out like a shooting star in the neon-lit sky. She glanced at the clock, 11:11 p.m. Her grandmother used to say that was the time when wishes were most powerful, when the universe listened most closely to the desires of the heart. Taking a deep breath, Charisse began to type. Your analysis of shadows of self shows me you understand something many miss. That art, like people, holds depths that aren't always visible at first glance. The Nigerian patterns are indeed intentional, a tribute to my mother's heritage, and a reminder that beauty exists in the blend of seemingly contrasting elements. Her fingers moved faster now, the words flowing naturally as she opened up about her art, her influences, and the themes of identity and perception that drove her work. For once, she didn't filter her passion or intelligence, didn't try to make herself smaller or more palatable. As she neared the end of her message, her cursor blinked expectantly. The usual fear crept in, the worry that being too intellectual, too deep would scare him away. Past experiences had taught her that many men preferred simple, surface-level exchanges. But something about Magnus's thoughtful message made her want to take the risk. She added a final line. I'd love to hear more about your own experiences with cultural identity and architecture. How do you balance traditional influences with modern demands? Before doubt could paralyze her again, Charisse pressed send. The message swooped up into its bubble and she felt her heart rate spike. There was no taking it back now. She set her phone face down on the coffee table, trying to distract herself by focusing on the city lights beyond her window. Las Vegas never slept, its endless energy both exhausting and exhilarating. Sometimes she felt like the city itself was a metaphor for her life. Bright lights and shadows, surface glamour and hidden depths, endless possibilities and crushing disappointments. The gentle vibration of her phone against the glass table made her jump. Already? She forced herself to count to 10 before reaching for it, her hand shaking slightly as she turned it over. Magnus had replied, "Thank you for sharing that with me. Your understanding of the power of contrasts resonates deeply with my own journey. As a half-Japanese, half-British architect working in America, I've often felt caught between worlds, between expectations. My latest project actually..." Charisse settled deeper into her couch, drawing her knees up to her chest as she read his thoughtful response. The neon lights of the strip painted her walls in soft pinks and blues, but for once, she barely noticed the city's constant performance. She was too engrossed in this unexpected connection, this possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, she'd found someone who could see beyond the surface. Their conversation flowed naturally, touching on art, architecture, cultural identity, and the challenge of staying authentic in a world obsessed with appearances. Hours slipped by unnoticed until the first hints of dawn began to paint the sky in gentle lavender hues. It was only when her eyes grew heavy that Charisse realized she'd been smiling for hours. For the first time in years, she'd let her guard down completely, sharing thoughts and feelings she usually kept hidden behind careful walls. Even more surprisingly, Magnus had matched her vulnerability with his own, creating a space where authenticity felt not just safe, but celebrated. As she finally prepared for bed, the sun rising over the desert mountains, Charisse felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Not the desperate, pleading kind that had led to so many disappointments, but something quieter and more profound. A gentle whisper that maybe, just maybe, there were still people in the world who could see beyond the surface to the beauty beneath. She fell asleep with her phone beside her pillow, their conversation still open on the screen. In her dreams, she built bridges between islands of light, each one stronger than the last, each one leading her closer to a place where she could finally be seen for who she truly was. The dating app's soft blue light gradually faded as her screen went dark, but the warmth of connection lingered, promising that perhaps this time things would be different. Perhaps this time she had found someone who could see through all the layers to the truth of her heart. Chapter 2. Invisible Walls. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Charisse's apartment, casting long shadows across her digital workspace. Her stylus moved with practiced precision across the tablet's surface as she worked on her latest commission, but her mind kept drifting to the message notification that had lit up her phone moments ago. 3 weeks had passed since that first late-night conversation with Magnus, and each day since had brought a deeper level of connection. Their exchanges had evolved from discussions of art and architecture to sharing childhood memories, dreams, and the kind of vulnerable truths usually kept hidden behind careful walls. Charisse set down her stylus and reached for her phone. Unable to resist the pull of his words any longer, his message filled her screen. "I've been thinking about what you said about your digital piece, Metamorphosis. How transformation often requires us to break down our own walls before we can truly emerge. It resonates with a project I'm working on, converting an abandoned prison into a community arts center. The challenge isn't just in the physical transformation of concrete and steel, but in helping people see beyond what the building used to be to what it could become. Sometimes I wonder if we humans aren't similar, trapped by the walls we've built around ourselves, waiting for someone to see our potential for change." Her heart fluttered at the philosophical depth of his observation. Magnus had a way of weaving profound insights into everyday conversations, making her feel both seen and challenged to grow. She found herself opening up to him in ways she never had with anyone else, sharing thoughts she usually kept locked away in the depths of her mind. But there was still one wall she couldn't bring herself to break down: her photos. Her dating profile remained deliberately sparse, with only abstract art pieces where personal photos should be. Each time Magnus gently inquired about seeing her face, she deflected with practiced ease. "I prefer to meet in person. Some things can't be captured in photographs." The truth was more complicated. Years of experiencing how quickly men's interest could fade once they saw her natural features, her full lips, broad nose, and kinky hair that defied Nevada's dry heat, had left deep scars. In the cutthroat world of Las Vegas's art scene, she'd learned to straighten her hair and adopt a more marketable appearance for client meetings. But with Magnus, she wanted something different, something real. Her phone buzzed again. "I'm giving a talk at UNLV's architecture department next week about adaptive reuse in urban spaces. Would you consider attending? I'd love to finally meet the brilliant mind behind these fascinating conversations." Charisse's throat tightened. The prospect of meeting in person filled her with equal parts longing and terror. Their intellectual and emotional connection had become precious to her, a rare gem in the desert of superficial interactions. The thought of losing it made her hands tremble. She got up from her desk and walked to the wall-length mirror in her bedroom. Her reflection stared back, a woman in her late 20s, wrapped in a comfortable, oversized sweater that had become her work-from-home uniform. She'd left her hair natural today, thick coils forming a halo around her face. No makeup concealed her dark skin's natural undertones or the small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident. "I prefer to meet in person," she typed, her standard response feeling hollow now. But before she could hit send, she forced herself to continue. "But I need you to understand something first. I've built these walls for a reason. In a city where image is everything, I've learned the hard way that people's interest often fades when reality doesn't match their expectations." Her finger hovered over the send button, heart pounding. Was she really ready to start dismantling these carefully constructed walls? Magnus's response came quickly. "The walls we build to protect ourselves often end up becoming our prisons. I understand having defenses. Believe me, being a mixed-race architect in an industry that still clings to certain traditional images has taught me plenty about expectations and prejudices. But Charisse, nothing you could show me would change the connection we've built. These conversations, your thoughts, your passion for art and life, that's what draws me to you. Tears blurred her vision as she read his words. The sincerity in them touched something deep within her, a longing to be accepted for who she was, not who others wanted her to be. She found herself typing again. Your talk at UNLV. What time? The next week passed in a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Charisse threw herself into her work, completing 2 major commissions and starting a new personal piece, inspired by her conversations with Magnus. The canvas depicted a prison transforming into a butterfly, its concrete walls becoming delicate wings, a metaphor for the transformation she felt happening within herself. The morning of Magnus's talk arrived with unusual clarity for Las Vegas, the desert air crisp and clean after a rare night of rain. Charisse stood before her closet, hands trailing over the designer clothes she usually wore to professional events. After a long moment, she pushed them aside and reached instead for a hand-woven dress her mother had brought from Nigeria. The fabric's vibrant patterns told stories of transformation and renewal, fitting for today. She left her hair in its natural state, the coils catching the sunlight as she made her final preparations. Her hands shook slightly as she applied a minimal amount of makeup, just enough to enhance her features without trying to alter them. For the first time in years, she was choosing to present herself exactly as she was. The drive to UNLV's campus gave her too much time to think. What if Magnus's acceptance of her invisible self didn't extend to her visible reality? What if seeing her in person shattered the connection they'd built? The radio played softly in the background, Etta James's At Last, and Charisse couldn't help but laugh at the universe's sense of timing. The architecture department's lecture hall was already filling up when she arrived. She chose a seat near the back, her heart racing as she watched people filter in. Which one was Magnus? She'd seen his profile photo, of course, but people could look so different in real life. Then he walked onto the stage, and her breath caught in her throat. Magnus moved with quiet confidence, his mixed heritage evident in his features, high cheekbones and almond-shaped eyes speaking to his Japanese ancestry, while his height and build reflected his British side. He wore a charcoal suit that spoke of understated elegance, but it was his smile that captured her attention, warm and genuine, reaching all the way to his eyes. His presentation was masterful, weaving technical expertise with philosophical insights about transformation and perception. When he spoke about seeing beyond surface appearances to recognize hidden potential, his eyes scanned the audience, and for a moment, Charisse felt as though he was speaking directly to her. After the talk, people crowded around him with questions and comments. Charisse remained in her seat, gathering her courage. She watched as he engaged with each person thoughtfully, giving them his full attention despite what must have been mounting fatigue. Finally, the crowd thinned. Magnus looked up, his eyes searching the nearly empty lecture hall. Taking a deep breath, Charisse stood and walked down the aisle toward him. She saw the moment of recognition in his eyes, not of her physical appearance, which he was seeing for the first time, but of something deeper. Perhaps he recognized the way she carried herself, or sensed the energy she'd described in their messages. "Charisse?" he asked softly, stepping forward to meet her. She nodded, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Your talk was incredible," she managed to say, "especially the part about how our preconceptions often blind us to hidden beauty." His smile widened, genuine warmth radiating from his expression. "Thank you for coming," he said, and then added quietly, Thank you for trusting me." They stood there for a moment, the empty lecture hall suddenly feeling intimate and vast at the same time. All the walls Charisse had built, all the defenses she'd constructed over years of disappointment, they didn't come crashing down in that moment. But she felt them shift, becoming more permeable, less absolute. "Would you like to get coffee?" Magnus asked. "I'd love to hear your thoughts about adaptive reuse in the digital age. Your perspective as an artist would be invaluable." Charisse felt a smile spreading across her face, natural and unguarded. "I'd like that," she said, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to hide or alter any part of herself. The walls were still there, but now they had windows and doors, offering the possibility of connection while maintaining the strength she'd built over years of protecting herself. As they walked together toward the campus coffee shop, their conversation flowed as easily in person as it had through messages. The invisible walls that had seemed so necessary began to feel more like bridges, connecting rather than separating, protecting without imprisoning. The Nevada sun painted everything in golden light, and Charisse couldn't help but think about how sometimes the most beautiful transformations happened not in grand, dramatic moments, but in quiet choices to be authentic, to trust, to allow ourselves to be seen, truly seen, by another soul who recognizes the beauty beneath all our carefully constructed walls. Chapter 3. The Mask. The thrift store bell chimed as Charisse stepped inside, the scent of old fabric and forgotten memories enveloping her. 2 weeks had passed since her first meeting with Magnus at UNLV. 2 weeks of coffee dates and long walks through the arts district, each moment deepening their connection. Now, as their first formal date at the Bellagio approached, she'd made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. "Can I help you find anything?" asked an elderly woman behind the counter, her silver hair caught in the dusty sunlight streaming through the windows. Charisse shook her head, already moving toward the women's section. Her fingers trailed over fabrics, searching for pieces that would serve her purpose. A shapeless sweater 3 sizes too large, its once vibrant pattern faded to a dull moss. A skirt that hung awkwardly, its hem uneven and its waist elasticized beyond recovery. Each item she selected was carefully chosen to create an image of someone who didn't care about appearances, or perhaps cared too much about hiding. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Baby girl, why do you need to test love? True love sees with the heart." But Charisse had learned the hard way that hearts could be deceived by pretty words and temporary charm. She'd watched too many men's eyes change when they thought she wasn't looking, seen too many connections fade when the reality of her didn't match their fantasies. At home, she laid out her purchases across her bed, the thrift store clothes, a pair of thick-rimmed glasses from a costume shop, and makeup she'd specifically bought to create artificial blemishes and uneven skin tone. Her professional makeup kit sat untouched on her vanity, its contents designed to enhance rather than disguise. Her phone buzzed with a message from Magnus. "Just confirmed our reservation at Largo for Saturday. Can't wait to see you there. These past 2 weeks have been incredible." Charisse smiled despite the knot in her stomach. Their coffee shop conversations had revealed a man of depth and understanding, someone who saw beauty in unexpected places. He'd told her stories of growing up between cultures, of fighting to prove himself in an industry that often favored tradition over innovation. But still, doubt whispered in her ear like an old friend. She opened her laptop and pulled up tutorials on theatrical makeup. Her years as a digital artist had given her a keen eye for detail and transformation. Skills she now turned to a different kind of artistry. She practiced for hours, learning how to create convincing artificial flaws, how to make her skin appear uneven and troubled. Her mother called while she was experimenting with different techniques. "Charisse, my sunshine, how are you?" "I'm good, Mama, just preparing for something. There was a pause on the line. Her mother had always been able to read the undertones in her voice. "Tell me about him." Charisse found herself spilling everything: the dating app conversations, the coffee meetings, the way Magnus spoke about architecture as a bridge between past and future. And finally, her plan to test him. "You know," her mother said softly, "when I first came to America, I tried so hard to change my accent to fit in. Your father was the first person who told me my accent was beautiful, that it carried the music of my homeland. But I didn't believe him at first. I tested him too, spoke with an even stronger accent for weeks. He just smiled and said it reminded him of poetry." Tears pricked at Charisse's eyes. "Did you ever regret testing him?" "No, sunshine. Sometimes we need to protect our hearts until we're sure they're safe. Just remember, the right person won't just pass your test, they'll make you question why you needed it in the first place." After hanging up, Charisse returned to her preparations with renewed purpose. She spent hours practicing walking differently, slightly hunched as if trying to disappear. She recorded herself speaking, adjusting her usual confident tone to something more hesitant, more unsure. The days leading up to Saturday felt like preparing for a performance, but one where the stakes were impossibly high. She found herself analyzing every interaction she'd had with Magnus, searching for signs she might have missed. The way he'd touched her hand at the coffee shop, gentle but sure. How his eyes lit up when she challenged his ideas about modern architecture's relationship with nature. The respect in his voice when she spoke about her Nigerian heritage and its influence on her art. Friday night, she couldn't sleep. She stood on her balcony, watching the Vegas lights paint the sky in artificial dawn. Below, couples strolled along the strip, some dressed to impress, others comfortable in tourist casual. All of them wearing their own kinds of masks, she realized. She thought about her latest digital art piece, still unfinished on her tablet. It showed a woman standing before a mirror, but instead of a reflection, the mirror revealed layer after layer of different faces, each one representing a different aspect of self. She'd started it after her first meeting with Magnus, inspired by their discussions about identity and perception. Saturday morning arrived with the dry heat typical of Nevada summers. Charisse began her transformation early, taking her time with each element. She applied the makeup with an artist's precision, creating subtle imperfections that looked natural rather than theatrical. The artificial blemishes were placed strategically, designed to draw attention without looking obviously fake. She pulled on the thrift store clothes, adjusting them to hang awkwardly. The sweater was hot and uncomfortable in the desert heat, its synthetic fabric already making her skin itch. The skirt's uneven hem made her usually graceful walk appear clumsy. Her grandmother's glasses completed the look, their thick frames and slightly scratched lenses distorting her features. She'd cleaned them carefully, but left a smudge on one lens, another small detail in her carefully constructed disguise. Standing before her mirror, Charisse barely recognized herself. Gone was the polished digital artist who commanded respect in client meetings. Instead, she saw someone who seemed to want to fade into the background, someone who had given up on being seen. Her phone chimed with another message from Magnus. "Looking forward to tonight. There's something I want to show you. A new design concept, inspired by our conversations about art and transformation." The sincerity in his message made her heart ache. Was she being fair to him with this test, or was she potentially sabotaging something beautiful because of past wounds? She sat at her vanity, surrounded by the tools of her deception, and opened her journal. Inside, she'd been documenting her feelings throughout this journey, trying to understand her own motivations. Today's entry was simple. I need to know if he sees me, really sees me, or just the image I've carefully curated. In a city built on illusions, can anyone recognize authentic beauty? Tonight we'll answer that question, for better or worse. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her apartment as she made her final preparations. She practiced her modified walk one last time, checked that her artificial floors looked natural in different lights, and rehearsed the slightly nervous laugh she'd cultivated for the evening. Her mother's words came back to her. The right person won't just pass your test, they'll make you question why you needed it in the first place. Gathering her courage, Charisse grabbed her oversized purse, another carefully chosen piece that didn't match her usual style. Inside, she packed her regular makeup and a change of clothes, either for a quick escape or she wasn't sure what. Hope, perhaps. Hope that tonight would prove different from all the disappointments that had led her to this moment. As she left her apartment, she caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. Beneath all the carefully constructed imperfections, she saw something else. Strength. It took courage to risk rejection, to put love to the test, but it also took courage to be willing to be proven wrong, to be open to the possibility that sometimes, rarely but wonderfully, people could surprise you. The Las Vegas sun was beginning its descent as she made her way to her car, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In a few hours, she would come face to face with Magnus at the Bellagio, and everything would change. One way or another, masks would fall and truth would emerge. She touched the small silver pendant her grandmother had given her for luck, took a deep breath, and began her drive toward the Strip, toward Magnus, toward whatever revelation the evening would bring. The city lights began to flicker to life around her, a reminder that in Vegas, nothing was ever quite what it seemed. And sometimes, that was exactly the point. Chapter 4. The Bellagio Meeting. The Bellagio's famous fountains burst to life as Charisse pulled into the hotel's valet parking area, water and light dancing in perfect synchronization to Sinatra's "The Way You Look Tonight." The irony of the song choice wasn't lost on her as she handed her keys to the valet, carefully maintaining the slightly hunched posture she'd practiced. The evening air carried the peculiar mix of desert warmth and artificial cool that was uniquely Las Vegas, punctuated by the fine mist from the fountains. Charisse had chosen the Bellagio deliberately for this moment. Its grandeur would only heighten the contrast of her carefully crafted appearance. The marble floors reflected the crystal chandeliers overhead, creating an endless dance of light that made her feel simultaneously exposed and invisible. Her oversized sweater, despite the desert heat, hung awkwardly on her frame as she made her way through the lobby. The thick-soled shoes she'd selected scuffed slightly against the polished floor, the sound drawing a few curious glances from passing guests in their evening finery. She felt their eyes slide over her and away, dismissing her as someone who didn't belong in this temple of luxury and appearance. The conservatory sprawled before her, a botanical masterpiece that changed with the seasons. Tonight, it was decorated for autumn with towering arrangements of chrysanthemums and golden leaves, creating a warm canvas against which the evening's drama would unfold. She'd arrived early deliberately, wanting to center herself before the moment of truth. A family of tourists passed by, their designer clothes and carefully coordinated appearances a stark contrast to her thrift store ensemble. The mother's eyes lingered on Charisse's mismatched outfit, her expression a mix of pity and confusion. Once such looks would have cut deep, but tonight they were almost reassuring, proof that her disguise was working as intended. She checked her phone. 7:45 p.m. Magnus would be arriving soon for their 8 p.m. reservation at Lago. She'd chosen a spot near the entrance to the conservatory where the lighting was soft enough to be flattering, but bright enough for clear visibility. Her grandmother's glasses sat heavily on her nose, the slightly scratched lenses adding to her transformed appearance. The artificial blemishes she'd created felt warm under the hotel's lights, and she resisted the urge to touch them up. She'd spent hours ensuring they looked natural, using her artist's eye to create imperfections that would seem genuine rather than theatrical. Her normally confident posture remained carefully subdued, shoulders slightly rounded, as if bearing an invisible weight. Movement at the lobby entrance caught her eye, and her heart leaped into her throat. Magnus stepped through the revolving doors, his presence commanding attention without seeking it. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that complemented his mixed heritage features, making him look like he'd stepped out of an Architectural Digest cover. Several heads turned to watch him pass, and Charisse felt a moment of pride followed quickly by anxiety. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, someone who belonged in spaces like this. Would that confidence waver when he saw her? Would his eyes show that fleeting disappointment she'd seen so many times before? He paused near the conservatory entrance, scanning the area. Charisse took a deep breath, straightened her ill-fitting sweater one last time, and stepped forward. "Magnus," she called softly, purposely pitching her voice slightly higher than usual, adding a tremor of uncertainty she didn't have to entirely fake. The moment stretched like honey dripping from a spoon as he turned toward her voice. She saw the instant of recognition in his eyes, not of her physical appearance, which was dramatically different from their coffee shop meetings, but of something deeper. His smile, when it came, held the same warmth it had shown over philosophical discussions and shared dreams. "You must be my mysterious pen pal," he said, stepping forward with hand extended. His grip was firm but gentle, professional yet personal. But it was his eyes that caught and held her attention. They showed no disappointment, no hesitation, only genuine pleasure at seeing her. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting," he continued, his voice carrying the same rich tones that had made their phone conversation so engaging. "I was just admiring the fountain show on my way in. Something about the way they've engineered beauty from basic elements, water, light, and music, reminds me of your digital art." Charisse felt her carefully constructed walls tremble. She'd prepared herself for polite disgust, for barely concealed disappointment, even for kind rejection. But this genuine engagement, this immediate connection to her art, caught her off guard. "The reservation's not for a few minutes," Magnus continued, gesturing to the conservatory. "Would you like to walk through the display? The designers have done something fascinating with the spatial arrangement this season. They've created these little pocket gardens that tell different stories depending on the angle you view them from." She nodded, not trusting her voice. They moved through the conservatory together, and Magnus began pointing out details she might have missed. The way certain flowers were positioned to catch and reflect light, how the placement of each element contributed to the overall narrative of the space. "It reminds me of your piece, Layers of Truth," he said, stopping before a particularly complex arrangement. "How you use different perspectives to reveal different aspects of the same reality. These designers are working with physical space the way you work, with digital space, creating meaning through multiple layers of perception." Charisse felt tears threatening to form behind her grandmother's glasses. Here she was, deliberately dressed to fade into the background, and yet Magnus was seeing her, really seeing her, through her art, through her ideas, through the very essence of who she was, rather than what she looked like. They reached a quiet corner of the conservatory, where a delicate arrangement of orchids created an intimate space. Magnus turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You know, there's something I've been wanting to share with you. My latest project, the Community Arts Center I mentioned. The design was partly inspired by our conversations about transformation and authenticity." He pulled out his tablet, and Charisse found herself drawn into his enthusiasm as he showed her the plans. The building's design incorporated elements that changed appearance depending on the time of day and the viewer's position, creating an ever-shifting dialogue between structure and observer. "See how these panels seem solid from one angle, but become transparent from another," he explained, his fingers tracing the lines on the screen. "It's about challenging preconceptions, making people question what they think they know about space and appearance." The parallel to her own test tonight was almost too perfect. Here she stood, deliberately altered to appear one way while carrying another reality beneath the surface. And Magnus, without knowing it, was speaking directly to the heart of her experiment. A soft chime from his phone interrupted their discussion. "Ah, that's our reservation reminder," he said, tucking the tablet away. "Shall we head to Lago? I hear the view of the fountains is spectacular, though I suspect our conversation will be even more engaging." As they walked toward the restaurant, Charisse felt something shift inside her. The mask she'd so carefully constructed still felt physical on her skin, but its emotional weight had somehow lessened. Magnus's hand rested lightly on her back as they navigated through the evening crowd, a gentle gesture of both guidance and connection that spoke volumes about his character. The maitre d' at Lago greeted them with professional courtesy, though Charisse caught the slight raise of his eyebrow as he took in her appearance. But Magnus's manner never changed. He treated her with the same respect and attention he'd shown during their coffee shop meetings, the same genuine interest in her thoughts and ideas. As they were led to their table, one of the best in the house with a perfect view of the fountains, Charisse realized that her test might be revealing more than she'd anticipated, not just about Magnus's character, but about her own assumptions and fears. The lights of Las Vegas sparkled beyond the windows, and another fountain show began to unfold. But Charisse found her attention drawn not to the spectacular display outside, but to the man sitting across from her, whose eyes held neither judgment nor pretense, only genuine interest in the person beneath whatever mask she chose to wear. The evening was just beginning, and already she felt the walls she'd built beginning to crack, letting in something that felt dangerously like hope. The mask she wore suddenly felt less like a test and more like a reminder of all the defenses she might no longer need. Chapter 5. First Glance. The Lago restaurant sparkled with understated elegance, its modern Italian design offering a sophisticated backdrop for the evening ahead. Magnus stood tall near their window-side table, pulling out Charisse's chair with natural grace that spoke of genuine courtesy rather than practiced charm. His tailored suit caught the soft lighting perfectly, but it was his eyes that commanded attention, warm, intelligent, and focused entirely on her. Outside their window, the Bellagio fountains prepared for another performance, their still waters holding the promise of imminent beauty. Inside, Charisse felt her heart beating against her ribs as she settled into her seat, carefully maintaining the slightly uncertain posture she'd practiced. Her oversized sweater felt even more out of place in this refined setting, where other diners wore evening wear that probably cost more than her monthly rent. "The view is spectacular," Magnus commented as he took his seat. "But I have to admit I'm more interested in hearing your thoughts about that series of digital installations you mentioned, the ones exploring the intersection of traditional Nigerian patterns and modern urban spaces." His words caught her off guard, as they often did. Here she sat, deliberately dressed to fade into the background, yet he immediately steered their conversation toward her art, her passions, her mind. The waiter approached with menus, his professional mask slipping just slightly as he took in Charisse's appearance. But Magnus's attention never wavered. "I'd love to hear your perspective on how architectural spaces influence human behavior," he continued, his voice carrying genuine curiosity. "Your latest piece, the one with the transforming corridors, it reminded me of something I've been exploring in my community center design." As they discussed their respective creative processes, Charisse found herself leaning forward, momentarily forgetting her practiced posture of insecurity. Her grandmother's glasses slipped slightly down her nose, and she pushed them back up with a gesture that felt increasingly artificial. Magnus's enthusiasm for their conversation was infectious, drawing her out of her carefully constructed shell. The sommelier approached their table, and Charisse tensed, expecting the kind of subtle dismissal she'd experienced so often in upscale establishments. But Magnus turned to her first. "Do you have any preferences? I noticed from our coffee shop conversations that you have quite a knowledge of wine." She blinked, surprised he'd remembered that detail from weeks ago. How she'd mentioned her father's wine collection and her own growing interest in viniculture. The sommelier waited patiently as she discussed various options with Magnus, his initial skepticism fading as she demonstrated her expertise. Their wine selection made, Magnus raised his glass in a toast to unexpected connections and the beauty of authentic conversations, he said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her artificial blemishes feel suddenly warm under the restaurant's intimate lighting. As their appetizers arrived, a carefully curated selection they'd chosen together, Magnus shared stories about his latest architectural projects. His passion for creating spaces that challenged perspectives while honoring cultural heritage resonated deeply with Charisse's own artistic philosophy. "You know," he said, pausing thoughtfully, "there's something remarkable about how you translate emotional experiences into visual language. It's similar to what I try to achieve in architecture, but you do it with such nuance in the digital realm." A couple at a nearby table was openly staring at them now, or more specifically, at Charisse's deliberately disheveled appearance in contrast to Magnus's polished presence. But Magnus remained completely engaged in their conversation, his attention never straying, his interest never flagging. The main course arrived, each plate a work of culinary art that matched the restaurant's elegant atmosphere. Magnus asked questions about her childhood in Louisiana, remembering details from their previous conversations and building on them with genuine curiosity. He shared his own experiences of growing up between cultures, of feeling like he never quite fit into any single category. "Sometimes," he said, cutting into his perfectly prepared fish, "I think the most interesting perspectives come from those spaces in between, the areas where different worlds overlap and create something entirely new." Charisse felt her throat tighten with emotion. Here was someone who truly understood the complexity of existing between worlds, of navigating spaces where identity wasn't simple or straightforward. Her carefully constructed test suddenly felt both more important and more artificial than ever. The fountains outside erupted in another spectacular display, water and light dancing to a classical piece she recognized from her mother's collection. Magnus paused their conversation to watch, but his eyes kept returning to her face, as if he found her more fascinating than the famous water show. "You remind me of these fountains in a way," he said softly, surprising her. "There's this incredible depth beneath the surface, this complexity that reveals itself in layers. Each time I talk with you, I discover something new and beautiful." His words struck her heart like lightning, illuminating the artificial nature of her current presentation in contrast to the genuine connection they were sharing. The mask she wore felt heavier with each passing moment, even as Magnus's sincerity made her want to shed it completely. A server accidentally bumped their table, causing Charisse's water glass to splash slightly. Magnus reached out instinctively, steadying both the glass and her hand. The brief contact sent electricity through her skin, making her even more aware of the disconnect between her external presentation and her internal reality. As they moved on to dessert, a shared tiramisu that the chef had personally recommended, Magnus pulled out his tablet again, eager to show her the latest refinements to his community center design. "I've incorporated some elements inspired by your digital art," he explained, his excitement palpable. The way you use negative space to create meaning, I've tried to translate that into physical architecture. The designs were stunning, showing a deep understanding of both traditional architectural principles and contemporary social needs. But what touched Charis most was how he genuinely integrated elements from their conversations about art and culture, creating something that honored both their perspectives. Looking at him in that moment, his face animated with passion for his work, his eyes bright with genuine enthusiasm, Charis felt something shift inside her. The walls she'd built, the masks she'd worn, the tests she'd designed, they all seemed to fade in importance compared to the authentic connection unfolding between them. Throughout the evening, Magnus had demonstrated not just acceptance of her deliberately altered appearance, but a complete focus on who she was beneath any external presentation. He engaged with her mind, her creativity, her spirit, seeing past everything superficial to recognize and celebrate her essential self. The fountain shows continued outside their window, each display a reminder of how beauty could emerge from the interplay of simple elements, water, light, and music coming together to create something magical. Inside, a different kind of magic was unfolding as two souls recognized themselves in each other, despite all artificial barriers. As their evening drew to a close, Magnus stood again to help her with her chair. In the restaurant's warm lighting, surrounded by the quiet murmur of other diners and the distant music of the fountains, Charis felt both seen and safe, a combination she'd rarely experienced before. "Thank you for sharing this evening with me," Magnus said as they prepared to leave, his voice carrying a depth of sincerity that touched her soul. "Your perspective on art, culture, and life, it's truly extraordinary. I feel fortunate to know you." Walking back through the Bellagio's grand spaces, Charis realized that somewhere during the evening, she'd stopped thinking about her disguise, stopped monitoring her posture and voice, stopped wondering if she was convincing enough in her role. Instead, she'd simply been present, engaged in genuine connection with someone who saw her, really saw her, regardless of any external presentation. The night air carried the subtle scent of the desert as they emerged from the hotel, the famous fountains performing one final show behind them. Magnus's presence beside her felt both exciting and comfortable, like finding a piece of home in an unexpected place. Her test wasn't over. There were still revelations to come, but already it had shown her something unexpected. Sometimes, the greatest discovery isn't whether someone else can see past our masks, but whether we're ready to let them do so. Chapter 6. Beyond Surface. The soft glow of Largo's ambient lighting played across their table as Charis and Magnus settled into a deep discussion about her work as a digital artist. The restaurant's elegant interior seemed to fade into the background as Magnus leaned forward, his attention completely focused on her words, his eyes alight with genuine interest. "Tell me more about your latest project," he encouraged, taking a sip of the wine they'd selected together. "The way you described merging traditional African patterns with modern digital landscapes. It sounds fascinating." Charis found herself forgetting the artificial blemishes on her skin, the oversized sweater that hung awkwardly on her frame as she described her creative process. "I've been exploring how cultural identity persists across digital spaces," she explained, her natural passion breaking through her practiced timidity. "There's this interesting tension between tradition and innovation, between holding onto heritage while embracing new forms of expression." Magnus nodded thoughtfully, his expression reflecting deep understanding. "That resonates with what I've been grappling with in architecture. How do we honor the past while building for the future? It's not just about preserving facades. It's about understanding the soul of a space, its cultural significance." The waiter approached with their appetizers, and Charis noticed his subtle double-take at her deliberately disheveled appearance. But Magnus's attention never wavered, his focus remaining entirely on their conversation. He gestured to the delicate arrangement of seafood before them, drawing a parallel between culinary presentation and digital art. "It's like these dishes," he observed. "The chef has taken traditional Italian recipes but presented them in a contemporary way. There's respect for the original essence while embracing modern techniques. Your work does something similar in the digital realm." As they enjoyed their appetizers, Magnus shared stories about his architectural projects, each one revealing a deep commitment to understanding the communities he designed for. He described a recent project in Tokyo where he'd incorporated elements of traditional Japanese architecture into a modern office building. "The challenge was creating something that felt both innovative and respectful," he explained, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. "We ended up using traditional proportions in unexpected ways, creating spaces that felt both familiar and fresh." Charisse found herself drawn into his enthusiasm, momentarily forgetting her role as someone trying to fade into the background. "That's exactly what I'm trying to achieve with my digital landscapes," she exclaimed, then caught herself attempting to return to her more subdued persona. But Magnus didn't seem to notice or care about these shifts in her presentation. Instead, he engaged with her ideas, asking thoughtful questions about her creative process and sharing relevant insights from his own field. Their main courses arrived, perfectly prepared dishes that exemplified the restaurant's reputation for excellence. As they began to eat, Magnus steered the conversation toward her background in digital art. "What drew you to digital media specifically?" he asked, genuinely curious. "There's something powerful about choosing a medium that's constantly evolving." Charisse considered his question, aware of how her grandmother's glasses slipped slightly down her nose. "I think it was the potential for transformation," she replied honestly. "In digital space, nothing is fixed. Everything can be altered, reimagined, but that very fluidity makes authenticity more valuable, not less." Magnus's eyes lit up at her response. "That's brilliant. The idea that constant potential for change makes authentic expression more significant. It's like in architecture, where the possibility of building anything makes it more important to build something meaningful." Their conversation flowed naturally from topic to topic, touching on art, architecture, culture, and identity. Magnus shared stories about growing up between cultures, about feeling simultaneously connected to and distant from his Japanese and British heritage. "Sometimes I think the most interesting perspectives come from those spaces in between," he reflected, pausing to appreciate a perfectly prepared bite of his entree. "The places where different worlds intersect and create something entirely new." Charisse felt her heart skip a beat at his words. How many times had she thought the same thing about her own work, her own identity? The artificial blemishes she'd so carefully applied felt suddenly heavy on her skin, a physical representation of the barriers she'd built around herself. As they continued their meal, Magnus showed her previews of his latest architectural designs on his tablet. His excitement was contagious as he explained how he'd incorporated principles from digital art into physical spaces. "See how these surfaces change appearance depending on the viewer's perspective," he demonstrated, sliding through the renderings. "I was inspired by how your digital pieces reveal different layers depending on how people interact with them." The fountains outside performed another spectacular show, but Charisse found herself more captivated by the way Magnus's face lit up when discussing his passion for creating meaningful spaces. He spoke about architecture not just as a profession, but as a way of shaping human experience and fostering connection. "Every space tells a story," he explained, gesturing to the restaurant around them. "The question is whether that story invites people in or keeps them at a distance. I've always believed that the best designs create opportunities for genuine interaction, for real connection." Their dessert arrived, a shared plate of tiramisu that the chef had personally recommended. As they enjoyed the delicate balance of flavors, their conversation turned to more personal matters. "What made you choose Las Vegas?" Magnus asked, genuinely curious about her journey to the city of illusions. Charisse paused, considering how much to reveal. "I think I was drawn to the contradiction," she admitted. "A city built on spectacle, yet filled with people seeking real connections. There's something beautiful about that tension." Magnus nodded thoughtfully. "It's like your art, finding authentic expression in a digital realm. The medium might be associated with artifice, but that just makes genuine emotion more powerful when it shows through." Throughout the evening, Magnus remained completely engaged, his attention never straying despite the occasional curious glances from other diners. He asked thoughtful questions about her work, remembered details from their previous conversations, and shared his own vulnerabilities with disarming honesty. As they finished their dessert, Charisse realized something profound. Throughout the entire meal, Magnus hadn't once commented on her appearance, either positively or negatively. Instead, he had engaged entirely with her mind, her creativity, her spirit. The artificial barriers she'd constructed seemed to be invisible to him, or perhaps simply irrelevant to what he valued about their connection. The evening drew to a close, but their conversation showed no signs of waning. They discussed their hopes for future projects, shared stories about cultural expectations and personal growth, and found countless points of connection between their seemingly different worlds. "You know," Magnus said as they prepared to leave, "I've been to many dinners in this restaurant, but none have been as enlightening as tonight. Your perspective on art, culture, and authenticity, it's truly remarkable." His words carried no hint of flattery, only genuine appreciation. As they stood to leave, Charisse felt something shift inside her. The mask she wore, both literal and metaphorical, felt increasingly unnecessary in the face of such authentic connection. Walking through the restaurant, Magnus continued sharing his thoughts about their discussion, completely unconscious of the curious glances they received from other diners. His focus remained entirely on their conversation, on the ideas and dreams they'd shared. The Bellagio fountains performed one final show as they made their way through the hotel, but neither paid much attention to the spectacular display. They were too engrossed in their discussion about the intersection of digital and physical spaces, about the beauty of authentic expression in an increasingly artificial world. Throughout the entire evening, Magnus had demonstrated something rare and precious, the ability to see beyond surface appearances to the essence of a person. His genuine interest in her thoughts, his engagement with her ideas, and his complete lack of concern for external appearances had shown Charisse something she hadn't expected to find. As they reached the hotel's entrance, their conversation still flowing naturally, Charisse realized that her test had revealed more than she'd anticipated. It wasn't just about whether Magnus could see past physical appearances. It was about whether she could allow herself to be truly seen, truly known, beyond all the layers of protection she'd built around herself. The night air carried the promise of desert stars as they prepared to part ways, both knowing that something profound had shifted during their dinner together. Beyond the surface of appearances, beyond the masks and pretenses, they had found a connection that defied conventional expectations, one based on genuine understanding, shared passions, and the courage to be authentically themselves. Chapter 7. The Revelation. The evening had flowed like a perfectly composed symphony, each moment building upon the last, creating something both beautiful and unexpected. As their dinner plates were cleared and fresh glasses of wine appeared before them, Charisse felt the weight of her artificial imperfections more acutely than ever. Throughout the entire meal, Magnus had treated her with a respect and attention that defied her carefully constructed appearance. The Bellagio fountains erupted outside their window once more, their dance now set to a haunting aria that seemed to echo the turmoil in Charisse's heart. She watched Magnus's profile as he appreciated the display, noting how the lights played across his features, highlighting the quiet strength and genuine warmth that had drawn her to him from their first meeting. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass, the oversized sleeve of her thrift store sweater catching awkwardly on the stem. The question that had been building inside her all evening finally broke free, carried on a whisper that barely rose above the ambient sounds of the restaurant. "Why aren't you put off?" Magnus turned from the fountain display, his attention immediately and completely focused on her. He set down his own wine glass with deliberate care, his expression serious but gentle. The moment stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken truths. "Beauty isn't about matching society's templates, Charisse," he said finally, his voice carrying the same thoughtful conviction she'd come to associate with their deepest conversations. "It's about the light in someone's eyes when they talk about their passions, the kindness in their words, the depth of their thoughts." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight with emotion. She glanced down at her plate, where the remnants of their shared dessert created abstract patterns that reminded her of her digital art. Layers upon layers of meaning waiting to be discovered. "But look at me," she pressed, gesturing to her deliberately disheveled appearance. "I'm not exactly fitting in here." She nodded toward the other diners in their evening finery, their polished appearances reflecting the luxury of their surroundings. Magnus leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" He paused, waiting until she met his gaze again. "I see the artist who created Digital Diaspora, a piece so powerful it made me rethink my entire approach to cultural spaces in architecture. I see the woman who spent an hour discussing the intersection of traditional craftsmanship and modern technology with such passion it changed my perspective on design." He gestured to the fountains outside. "Look at those waters. They're beautiful not because they conform to some predetermined pattern, but because they express something authentic and powerful. Your art does the same thing. It challenges perspectives, breaks boundaries, creates something new and meaningful." Charisse felt tears threatening to form behind her grandmother's glasses. This wasn't how these conversations usually went. She'd experienced too many moments where initial interest faded into polite distance, where connections withered in the face of appearances that didn't match conventional expectations. "But society has certain standards," she said softly, voicing the truth that had shaped so much of her life, especially here in Las Vegas. Magnus's response was immediate and passionate. "Society's standards are like outdated building codes. They might have served a purpose once, but they often prevent us from creating something truly revolutionary." He smiled, the warmth reaching his eyes. "In architecture, I learned early on that the most inspiring spaces are often the ones that challenge our preconceptions, that make us question what we think we know about beauty and function." He reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching hers. "When I first saw your digital art portfolio, I was struck by how fearlessly you explored the space between tradition and innovation, between expectation and authenticity. Your work doesn't ask permission to exist. It simply declares its truth and invites viewers to see the world differently." The fountain show outside had ended, but neither of them noticed. They remained locked in this moment of truth, this space between masks and reality. "Every time we've met," Magnus continued, "whether over coffee or tonight at dinner, I've been amazed by your insight, your creativity, your unique way of seeing the world. The way you blend Nigerian patterns with modern digital techniques, how you find beauty in unexpected places. That's what draws me to you. Not how you dress or what others might think, but who you are at your core. Charisse felt something shift inside her, like tectonic plates realigning to create a new landscape. She thought about all the times she'd hidden herself, adjusted her appearance to meet others' expectations, only to feel more isolated with each compromise. "But you're so..." She gestured vaguely at his impeccable appearance, his obvious comfort in this world of luxury and expectations. Magnus's laugh was gentle but genuine. "I'm so what? Conventional looking?" He shook his head. "Do you know how many times I've been told I don't look Japanese enough or British enough? How many clients have subtly suggested I might not understand their vision because I don't fit their idea of what an architect should look like?" He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of vulnerability. "That's why your art spoke to me so deeply. You create these spaces where different cultural elements don't just coexist, they transform into something entirely new, something that doesn't ask permission to exist or apologize for being different." The waiter approached their table, perhaps to offer coffee, but sensitively withdrew upon reading the intensity of their conversation. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant dance of dinner service, but they remained in their own world of revelation and truth. "In my work," Magnus continued, "I try to create spaces that challenge people's expectations, that make them question their assumptions about what architecture can be. But your art does something even more powerful. It creates spaces where authenticity isn't just allowed, it's celebrated." Charisse felt the walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crack. Years of protective layers, carefully constructed defenses against judgment and rejection, started to feel less like shelter and more like prison walls. "The first time I saw shadows of self in your portfolio," Magnus said, referring to one of her most personal pieces, "I knew I was seeing something rare, an artist who wasn't afraid to explore the complex relationship between appearance and identity, between surface and depth. That's what drew me to you, Charisse. Not how you look, but how you see, how you think, how you transform digital spaces into mirrors that reflect our deepest truths." His words resonated with something deep inside her, something that had been waiting to be acknowledged. She thought about all the masks she'd worn, all the versions of herself she'd created to please others or avoid judgment. And here was someone who seemed to see through all of them to something more fundamental. "But appearances matter," she whispered, "one last defense against hope, especially in a city like this." Magnus glanced around the elegant restaurant, then back to her with a smile that held both understanding and challenge. "Do they? Or do we just think they matter because we've been told they do? Look at this space. Yes, it's beautiful, but what makes it truly special isn't the expensive furnishings or the perfect lighting. It's the experiences people create here, the connections they form, the moments of truth they share." He reached for his wine glass, took a thoughtful sip. "You know what I see when I look around this restaurant? I see stories. Every person here is carrying their own narrative, their own dreams and fears and hopes. Just like in your digital landscapes, the surface is just the beginning. The real beauty lies in the layers beneath." Charisse felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the ones she'd held back earlier. These weren't tears of fear or uncertainty, but of recognition, of being truly seen, perhaps for the first time. The fountain show started again outside their window, water and light dancing in perfect synchronization, but neither of them turned to watch it. They remained focused on each other, on this moment of revelation that felt both terrifying and liberating. "Your art taught me something important," Magnus said softly. "It showed me that beauty isn't about fitting into existing templates. It's about having the courage to create new ones. Every piece you create challenges viewers to look deeper, to question their assumptions, to see beauty in unexpected places. He paused, his expression serious but tender. That's what I've been trying to tell you all evening, Charisse. The way you look, how you dress, those things are just the surface. What matters is the light I see in your eyes when you talk about your art, the passion in your voice when you describe your vision, the depth of thought you bring to every conversation. The artificial blemishes on her skin felt increasingly heavy, like a mask that had served its purpose and was ready to be shed. Her grandmother's glasses, the oversized sweater, the carefully constructed appearance of someone trying to fade into the background. All of it seemed suddenly unnecessary in the face of such clear-sighted acceptance. Magnus raised his wineglass in a small toast. To seeing beyond surfaces, he said softly. To having the courage to be authentically ourselves, regardless of society's templates. Charisse raised her own glass, her hand steady now despite the emotion coursing through her. As their glasses clinked gently together, she felt something profound shift inside her. The test she had designed to protect herself had revealed something unexpected. Not just about Magnus, but about her own capacity for trust, for hope, for love. Chapter 8. Truth Unveiled. Magnus's words about authentic beauty echoed in Charisse's mind as she excused herself from their table, her heart pounding with the weight of the decision she'd made. The path to Lago's elegant restroom felt like the longest walk of her life, each step carrying her closer to a moment of truth she hadn't planned for this evening. The restroom's soft lighting and marble surfaces created an atmosphere of luxury that matched the rest of the Bellagio. Charisse stood before the ornate mirror, studying her deliberately altered reflection. The artificial blemishes she'd so carefully applied now felt like chains rather than armor. Her grandmother's glasses, the oversized sweater, the carefully constructed appearance of someone trying to fade into the background, all of it seemed to mock the genuine connection she'd found with Magnus. A well-dressed woman at the adjacent sink gave her a curious glance before hurrying away, leaving Charisse alone with her thoughts and her reflection. She reached into her oversized purse, where her regular makeup bag waited like a secret weapon. But tonight, it would serve a different purpose. Not to create another mask, but to reveal the truth beneath. With trembling fingers, she began to remove the artificial blemishes she'd spent hours perfecting. Each swipe of the makeup remover revealed more of her natural skin, dark and beautiful like her mother's. She thought about Magnus's words about beauty existing in authenticity, in the light that shines through when someone speaks their truth. The glasses came off next, carefully folded and placed in their case. Without them, her eyes appeared as they truly were, bright, intelligent, lined with natural confidence rather than artificial uncertainty. She blinked at her reflection, already feeling more like herself. From her bag, she pulled out a small container of her regular moisturizer, the one that smelled faintly of hibiscus, her mother's favorite flower. As she applied it, she remembered all the times her mother had told her, "Your beauty is not just in your face, my sunshine, but in your spirit that shines through it." The oversized sweater came off next, revealing the simple but elegant blouse she'd worn underneath. It was one of her favorites, made from authentic African fabric that her grandmother had sent from Nigeria. The patterns spoke of heritage and strength, of stories passed down through generations of women who had learned to stand in their truth. Her hands moved to her hair next, releasing it from the awkward style she'd adopted for the evening. Her natural coils sprang free, forming a crown that reminded her of the digital art piece she'd created about cultural identity and beauty. How many times had she straightened these coils to fit others' expectations? Tonight, they would tell their own story. She reached for her makeup bag again, this time not to create artificial flaws, but to enhance her natural features with the subtle expertise she'd developed over years of professional work. A touch of highlighter to emphasize her cheekbones, a hint of color on her lips, not to mask, but to celebrate. As she worked, she thought about all the moments throughout dinner when Magnus had focused entirely on her words, her ideas, her passion for art. He had seen through her disguise not by looking past it, but by looking deeper, to the person she was beneath all the carefully constructed layers. The final touch was a spritz of her favorite perfume, a custom blend that combined desert sage with Nigerian jasmine, a scent that told the story of her mixed heritage just as surely as her art did. She'd avoided wearing it earlier, thinking it too sophisticated for the persona she'd created. Now it felt like the perfect finishing touch to her revelation. Standing back, Charisse took in her complete reflection. The woman who looked back at her wasn't trying to hide or fade away. Instead, she stood tall, her natural beauty enhanced rather than obscured, her confidence no longer a hidden secret, but a visible truth. She thought about the digital piece she'd been working on before this evening, a series of transforming portraits that revealed different layers of truth depending on how viewers interacted with them. In a way, she'd become one of her own artworks tonight, revealing different layers of herself, testing how others perceived and responded to each one. The restroom door opened, and another guest entered. This time, when their eyes met in the mirror, there was no awkward glance away. Instead, the woman smiled appreciatively, perhaps recognizing something of her own journey in Charisse's transformed appearance. Gathering her discarded disguise into her bag, Charisse took one final look in the mirror. The woman who stared back was neither the artificial construct she'd created for this test, nor the carefully polished professional she sometimes presented to clients. Instead, she was simply Charisse, artist, daughter of two cultures, woman standing in her truth. Her phone buzzed with a message from Magnus. "Hope everything's okay. The waiter brought coffee. I remembered you prefer Ethiopian beans." The thoughtfulness of his message, remembering such a small detail from their previous conversations, made her smile. He had seen her authentic self even through her disguise, not because he was unobservant, but because he had been looking at what truly mattered all along. Taking a deep breath, Charisse gathered her courage and her belongings. The walk back to their table would be another kind of revelation, not of who she was trying to be, but of who she had always been beneath the masks she wore. The restaurant's atmosphere felt different as she emerged from the restroom, as if the very air had changed with her transformation. The soft lighting that had once felt exposing now felt warm and welcoming. The elegant surroundings that had seemed to judge her earlier now felt like a fitting backdrop for this moment of truth. She could see Magnus from a distance, sitting at their table with his back to her, his posture relaxed but attentive as he reviewed something on his tablet, probably one of his architectural designs. He had mentioned wanting to show her some new ideas inspired by their conversations about digital art and physical space. As she approached, her heartbeat quickened, but not from fear. This was the anticipation of revelation, of choosing to be seen fully and truthfully by someone who had already recognized her worth beyond any surface appearance. The fountain show outside their window began again, its waters dancing in perfect synchronization to a piece of classical music she recognized, Debussy's Clair de Lune. The same piece had been playing in her studio when she'd completed Shadows of Self, the artwork that had first caught Magnus's attention. Magnus looked up at the sound of her approaching footsteps, and she saw his breath catch, not in shock or surprise, but in recognition. His eyes met hers with the same warmth and interest they'd held all evening, but now there was something more. Understanding, appreciation, and a deeper connection that transcended physical appearance. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken recognition. Magnus stood, not out of social convention, but in acknowledgement of the courage this moment represented. His smile held no triumph at being proven right about seeing beneath surfaces, no judgment about her test. Instead, it conveyed only genuine joy at seeing her step fully into her truth. As Charis took her seat again, she felt a profound shift in the evening's energy. The test she had designed to protect herself had revealed something unexpected, not just about Magnus's character, but about her own capacity to be truly seen and accepted. The coffee he'd ordered for her steamed gently in its cup, its rich aroma mixing with the subtle scent of her perfume. Outside, the fountains continued their dance, but neither of them paid attention to the display. They were too caught up in this moment of authentic connection, of truth unveiled and accepted. Magnus's eyes held hers across the table, and in them she saw not just acceptance of her physical transformation, but appreciation for the courage it represented. The walls she had built, the masks she had worn, they hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had transformed, becoming windows rather than barriers, allowing genuine connection while honoring the strength she'd developed through years of protecting herself. The evening stretched before them, full of promise and possibility, as they prepared to begin their conversation anew. Not as test subject and examiner, but as two people choosing to see and accept each other in all their complex, beautiful truth. Chapter 9. Raw Honesty. The soft glow of Largo's chandeliers seemed to hold them in a private bubble as Charis settled back into her seat, her heart racing with the magnitude of what she'd just revealed. Magnus's warm gaze remained steady, accepting, showing neither triumph nor judgment at her transformation. The weight of explanation hung between them like delicate crystal, waiting to either shatter or shine. "I needed to know if you were different," Charis began, her voice barely above a whisper as tears threatened to fall. The coffee Magnus had ordered for her steamed gently, its rich Ethiopian aroma providing a familiar comfort. "Every man I've met has treated me like a prize to be won or rejected based on appearance. I couldn't bear to be hurt again." Magnus reached across the table, taking her hand in his. The gesture was gentle but sure, grounding her in the moment as the full story began to pour out. "In this city especially," she continued, her free hand gesturing to the opulent surroundings, "everything is about the surface, the spectacle. I've had men pursue me when I'm dressed for gallery openings, then look right through me when they see me in my natural state. I've watched connections fade the moment I let my guard down, let them see the real me." The fountains outside provided a gentle backdrop to her words, their rhythmic dance echoing the ebb and flow of her emotions. Magnus listened intently, his thumb tracing small, comforting circles on her hand as she spoke. "My mother always told me that true beauty shines from within, but the world—" She paused, gathering her thoughts. "The world has a way of making you doubt even your strongest beliefs, especially in the art world, where image often matters more than substance." Magnus nodded thoughtfully, his eyes never leaving hers. "Tell me about what led to tonight's test," he encouraged softly. "I want to understand." Charis took a deep breath, drawing strength from his genuine interest. "There was a gallery opening last year. I'd straightened my hair, worn the right designer dress, played the part they expected. My digital art was receiving praise, collectors were interested, and this one curator—" She closed her eyes briefly at the memory. "He seemed different, intellectual, interested in the meaning behind my work." She paused to take a sip of coffee, its warmth helping to steady her voice. "The next day, I went to his gallery in my natural hair, wearing comfortable clothes instead of fashion armor. He looked right through me, didn't even recognize me. When I reminded him who I was, his entire demeanor changed. Suddenly my art was too ethnic, not commercial enough for his space." Tears finally spilled onto her cheeks, but these were tears of release rather than pain. Magnus reached into his pocket, offering a handkerchief with quiet understanding. After that, I started creating different versions of myself. The polished professional for client meetings, the exotic artist for gallery events, the approachable colleague for casual settings, each one a carefully constructed mask designed to protect the real me from rejection. The restaurant had grown quieter around them, as if the very atmosphere was holding space for her truth. Outside, the Vegas lights painted the sky in artificial dawn, a reminder of the city's endless capacity for reinvention. When we first connected on the dating app, she continued, dabbing at her eyes, your response to my art was so genuine, so thoughtfully analytical. You saw layers of meaning I hadn't even consciously included. But I've learned that intellectual appreciation doesn't always translate to personal acceptance. Magnus squeezed her hand gently. So you decided to test that acceptance, he said, his voice holding understanding rather than accusation. Charisse nodded, relief flooding through her at his comprehension. I needed to know if you could see past surface appearances to the person beneath, if you could recognize worth beyond social conventions and expectations. She gestured to her now natural appearance. This is me, the real me, not the carefully curated professional version, not the deliberately disheveled test subject from earlier, just me, mixed heritage, natural hair, all the features that don't quite fit society's template of beauty, and all the strength that comes from navigating those expectations, Magnus added softly, all the creativity that emerges from living between worlds, all the insight that develops from seeing beyond surfaces. Fresh tears welled in her eyes at his words. You don't feel manipulated, tested. Magnus's smile held warmth and understanding. Charisse, every interaction is a kind of test. We're all constantly assessing, evaluating, trying to determine if it's safe to be ourselves with someone else. You just had the courage to be deliberate about it. He released her hand briefly to reach into his tablet case, pulling out a small sketchbook. May I show you something? She nodded, curious. He opened the book to reveal a series of architectural sketches, preliminary designs for his community arts center project. See these different views, he explained, turning pages gently. Each one shows the same structure from a different perspective. From some angles, it appears traditionally formal. From others, it reveals unexpected elements of playfulness and innovation. But none of these views is false. They're all authentic aspects of the same truth. His fingers traced the lines of one particularly complex drawing. Your test tonight reminded me of this design principle. You showed me different facets of yourself, different ways of presenting to the world. But what drew me in wasn't any particular presentation. It was the depth of thought behind your words, the passion in your ideas, the authenticity in your perspective. Charisse felt something shift inside her chest, as if a long-carried burden was finally beginning to lift. I've never met anyone who understood so quickly, so completely. Perhaps, Magnus said thoughtfully, because I've lived my own version of this journey, being mixed race in a field that often expects architects to fit certain cultural molds. I've learned that authentic connection only happens when we stop trying to match others' expectations and start being true to ourselves. The fountain show outside had ended, but neither of them noticed its absence. They remained wrapped in this moment of profound understanding, of barriers falling away to reveal something rare and precious. Thank you, Magnus said suddenly, surprising her. For what? For trusting me with your truth. For having the courage to test not just my character, but our potential for genuine connection. That kind of honesty, that willingness to risk vulnerability for the sake of authentic understanding. It's rare, especially in a city built on surfaces and spectacle. Charisse felt a smile break through her tears, genuine and unguarded. Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me, regardless of how I presented myself. You know what first drew me to your digital art? Magnus asked, his expression thoughtful. It wasn't just the technical skill or the cultural fusion. It was how each piece revealed different layers of truth, depending on how viewers interacted with it. Tonight, you became one of your own artworks, revealing different aspects of yourself, testing how others perceive and respond to each layer. His observation struck her deeply. She had never thought of her test in those terms, but he was right. Just as her digital pieces invited viewers to look beyond the surface, she had created an experience that challenged conventional perceptions of beauty and worth. The evening around them had grown softer, more intimate, as other diners gradually departed. Their coffee cups sat empty, forgotten in the depth of their conversation. Yet neither made any move to leave, both sensing the importance of this moment of raw honesty. "Where do we go from here?" Charisse asked softly, voicing the question that hung between them. Magnus's response held the same thoughtful sincerity that had characterized their entire evening. "Forward, together, without masks or tests. Though I hope you'll keep challenging my perceptions, keeping me aware of the different layers of truth in our world." His words held promise rather than pressure, invitation rather than demand. In that moment, Charisse recognized that her test had revealed not just Magnus's character, but her own readiness to be truly seen, truly known by someone who could appreciate all her complexity. The Las Vegas night sparkled beyond their window, its lights both artificial and beautiful, much like the journey that had brought them to this moment of authentic connection. Chapter 10. The Dance. After settling their dinner bill, Magnus and Charisse found themselves drawn to the Bellagio's conservatory and botanical gardens. The evening crowd had thinned, leaving the spectacular space feeling almost private. Towering autumn arrangements created intimate pathways between exhibits, their golden hues casting warm shadows in the carefully designed lighting. "There's something magical about this place at night," Charisse observed, her natural confidence now fully restored. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as they walked, no longer trying to fade into the background, but moving with graceful purpose. Magnus nodded, his hand finding the small of her back as they navigated between towering floral displays. "It's like your digital landscapes," he said thoughtfully, "the way light and shadow play together to create something both artificial and profoundly real." They paused before a stunning arrangement of chrysanthemums and fall foliage that reached toward the glass ceiling. The flowers seemed to dance in the gentle air circulation, their movements creating ever-changing patterns of light and shadow. "You know," Magnus said, turning to face her, "I've been designing public spaces for years, but I'm still amazed by how the right environment can transform human interaction. Look at how people move through here. They slow down, speak more softly, notice details they might otherwise miss." Charisse smiled, recognizing the passionate spark in his eyes when he discussed architecture. "It's the same in digital art," she responded, "creating spaces that encourage people to pause, to look deeper, to discover layers of meaning they might have overlooked." Soft music drifted from the nearby lounge, a jazz quartet playing a gentle rendition of "The Way You Look Tonight." The irony of the song choice wasn't lost on either of them, given the evening's events. Magnus's eyes met hers with warm humor and understanding. Without a word, he extended his hand in invitation. Charisse felt her heart skip as she placed her hand in his, letting him draw her into a gentle dance. They moved together naturally, as if they'd done this countless times before, finding their rhythm in the space between classical steps and creative interpretation. Other visitors passed by, some casting curious or appreciative glances their way, but neither Magnus nor Charisse paid them any attention. They were lost in their own world, where the boundaries between art and reality, between performance and authenticity, seemed to blur and fade. "You're a wonderful dancer," Charisse remarked, surprised by how effortlessly they moved together. Magnus smiled, executing a perfect turn that made her laugh with delight. "My Japanese grandmother insisted on traditional dance lessons when I was young. She said understanding how to move through space was essential for an architect." As they danced, Magnus shared stories about his grandmother, a formidable woman who had survived World War II and gone on to become one of Tokyo's first female business owners. "She taught me that true strength often lies in flexibility," he said, demonstrating with a graceful adjustment to avoid a passing tourist family. Charisse found herself sharing too, stories about learning traditional Nigerian dances from her mother, about the ways movement and rhythm had influenced her digital art. "There's a flow to traditional African dance," she explained, "a way of telling stories through motion that I try to capture in my interactive pieces." The jazz quartet transitioned into a slower melody, and their dance naturally adjusted to match. Magnus held her closer now, their movements more intimate, but still maintaining that perfect balance between structure and creativity that seemed to define their connection. "You know," Magnus said softly, "when I first saw your portfolio, there was this piece that caught my attention, Rhythms of Heritage. The way you blended traditional dance patterns with digital architecture, it changed how I thought about movement through designed spaces." Charisse looked up at him, surprised. "That piece wasn't even featured on my main page. You must have really explored the gallery." "I couldn't help myself," he admitted. "Each piece revealed something new about how you see the world. It was like discovering a new language that somehow felt familiar." They moved past a stunning array of autumn-hued orchids, their dance now more of a gentle sway as they talked. Other couples had joined them in the garden's open spaces, creating an impromptu dance floor amid the botanical displays. "It's funny," Charisse mused, "how this evening turned out so differently than I planned. I came here to test you, to see if you could look past surface appearances. Instead, I found myself learning to trust again." Magnus's hand tightened slightly on hers, a gesture of understanding and support. "Sometimes the best designs emerge from challenging our initial plans," he said. "Like in architecture, often it's the unexpected constraints that lead to the most innovative solutions." A family with young children passed by, the little ones pointing excitedly at the dancing couples. Magnus and Charisse paused their dance to let them pass, sharing a smile at the children's enthusiasm. When they resumed, their movement felt even more natural, as if they'd found a deeper rhythm together. "When I was designing the Community Arts Center," Magnus shared as they moved through the garden, "I kept thinking about how to create spaces that encourage this kind of moment, where people feel safe enough to be authentic, to connect, to dance if they want to." The music shifted again, this time to a classical piece that Charisse recognized from her mother's collection. Without missing a beat, they adjusted their dance, Magnus leading her through a more traditional waltz that somehow still felt fresh and personal. "You're full of surprises," Charisse said, admiring how easily he moved between dance styles. "Says the woman who orchestrated an elaborate test of character through deliberate transformation," he teased gently, his eyes twinkling with warmth. They both laughed, the sound mixing with the music and the gentle splash of nearby fountains. Their dance had taken them through most of the conservatory, each new setting providing a different backdrop for their continuing conversation. Curious onlookers occasionally paused to watch them, perhaps struck by the natural grace of their movement together, or maybe sensing the deeper connection that was clearly visible in their interaction. But Magnus and Charisse remained in their own world, where dancing in a public garden seemed the most natural thing in the world. "You know what this reminds me of?" Magnus said as they moved past a particularly spectacular fall display. "That scene in your digital piece, Convergence, where traditional and modern dance forms blend into something entirely new. We're doing that right now, creating something unique in this space between formal and spontaneous movement. Charisse felt her heart warm at his ongoing engagement with her art, his ability to find connections between their shared experiences and her creative work. "You really did study my portfolio thoroughly, didn't you?" "I wanted to understand the mind behind the art," he admitted. "Each piece revealed something new about how you see the world, how you think about space and movement and culture. It was like having a conversation before we ever met." The jazz quartet had begun playing again, this time a smooth bossa nova that seemed to perfectly capture the mood of the evening. Their dance evolved once more, incorporating elements of both their styles into something uniquely their own. "That's what I love about both our fields," Charisse reflected as they moved. "Whether it's digital art or architecture, we're always looking for ways to bring different elements together, to create something new while honoring what came before." Magnus nodded, executing another perfect turn that made the lights seem to dance around them. "It's about finding balance," he said. "Between tradition and innovation, between structure and creativity, between protecting ourselves and being open to connection." They had reached a quieter corner of the garden, where the music was softer and the lighting more intimate. Here, surrounded by autumn blooms and gentle shadows, their dance slowed to little more than a sway, though neither seemed inclined to stop completely. "Thank you," Charisse said softly, "for dancing with me, for seeing me, for understanding why I needed to test our connection." Magnus's response was to draw her slightly closer, his movement still respectful but more intimate. "Thank you for trusting me enough to reveal your truth, for being willing to take down those walls despite past hurts." The evening had grown late, but neither seemed to notice or care. They continued their gentle dance, sharing stories and insights, finding new ways to connect through movement and conversation. In this magical space, surrounded by the beauty of the Bellagio's gardens, they had found something rare and precious, a connection that transcended surface appearances to touch something deeper and more meaningful. The curious glances of passers-by no longer held any power over them. They had moved beyond the need for masks or tests, finding instead a shared language of movement and understanding that spoke more truthfully than words alone could express. Chapter 11. Midnight Confessions. Under the starlit Nevada sky, Magnus and Charisse found themselves walking through the Bellagio's exterior gardens. The night air carried the crisp edge of desert autumn, a gentle contrast to the warmth they generated during their dance. The famous fountains performed their last shows of the night, creating a dreamlike backdrop for what would become one of their most intimate conversations. "You shared your truth with me tonight," Magnus said, his voice carrying a new depth of vulnerability. "I think it's time I shared mine." He guided them to a quiet bench overlooking the fountains, their shoulders touching lightly as they sat. "Being judged for what you are, or what you appear to be. I understand that more than you might think," he began, his eyes focused on the dancing waters before them. "My father comes from a long line of British military officers. The Falcon name has been associated with service to the Crown for generations. My grandfather commanded troops in World War II, my great-grandfather in World War I. Charisse turned slightly to study his profile, seeing new layers of meaning in the strength of his jawline, the straight set of his shoulders. The lights from the fountain show played across his features, highlighting the subtle blend of his mixed heritage. "When my father fell in love with my mother during a diplomatic posting in Tokyo, it caused quite a stir in both families," Magnus continued. "A decorated British officer and a Japanese art curator. It wasn't what either side had expected for their children." He pulled out his phone, opening a photo gallery that he clearly treasured. The first image showed a striking couple, A tall, distinguished-looking British man in military dress standing beside a petite Japanese woman whose elegant posture and artistic sensitivity were evident even in the old photograph. They fought hard for their love, Magnus said softly. Broke down barriers, challenged prejudices. But when I came along, he paused, gathering his thoughts. Let's just say that being mixed race in either culture presented its own challenges. Charis reached for his hand, offering silent support as he continued his story. In England, I was never British enough for some of my father's military colleagues. In Japan, despite speaking the language fluently and understanding the culture, I was always gaijin, the foreigner. And when I chose to pursue architecture instead of following my father's footsteps into the military, he shook his head, a mixture of old pain and hard-won wisdom in his expression. The Falcon men had served in the military for 5 generations. My decision to break that tradition was seen as a rejection of our heritage, a disappointment to the family name. The fountains erupted in a spectacular display, but neither of them paid much attention to the show. They were too wrapped up in this moment of shared understanding, of walls coming down between them. My mother understood. Magnus continued, squeezing Charis's hand gently. She saw how architecture allowed me to bridge my 2 worlds, to create spaces that could bring different cultures together. But my father, it took years before he could look at my designs without seeing them as a reminder of what he considered my failure. Charis nodded, understanding all too well the weight of family expectations and cultural pressure. How did you handle it? She asked softly. I threw myself into my work, Magnus replied, started exploring how architecture could tell stories of cultural fusion, of identity and belonging. Each project became a way of proving that being between worlds wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. He showed her more photos on his phone, early sketches of buildings that clearly drew inspiration from both European and Japanese design principles, projects that challenged traditional architectural boundaries while respecting cultural heritage. The turning point came with my first major project in London, he continued. I designed a cultural center that incorporated elements of traditional Japanese architecture into a distinctly British space. The press called it revolutionary and groundbreaking. But what meant more to me was seeing my father's face at the opening ceremony. Magnus smiled at the memory. He finally understood that I hadn't rejected our family's legacy of service. I'd just found a different way to serve, to make a difference in the world. A cool breeze swept across the garden, carrying the subtle scent of desert flowers. Charis moved closer, offering warmth and support as Magnus shared another photo, this one showing an elderly Japanese woman standing proudly in a traditional garden. My grandmother in Tokyo, he explained. She was the first one to show me how art and architecture could transcend cultural boundaries. She used to tell me that true beauty exists in the spaces between things, between tradition and innovation, between different cultures, between what people expect and what they discover. His voice grew softer, more reflective. When you showed me your digital art, especially pieces like Cultural Crossroads and Heritage Interface, I felt like I'd found someone who understood that space between worlds. Someone who knew what it meant to exist in those in-between places and find beauty there. The last fountain show of the night began, its waters rising and falling in perfect synchronization. Magnus turned to face Charis fully, his expression open and vulnerable. That's why your test tonight didn't offend me, he said. I recognized it for what it was, a necessary protection developed by someone who, like me, has learned that people often struggle to see beyond their expectations, beyond what they think they know about who you are or should be. Charis felt tears welling in her eyes again, but these were different from her earlier emotional release. These tears came from a place of recognition, of finding someone who truly understood her journey, "We're all wearing masks," Magnus continued softly. "The trick is finding someone who wants to see what's beneath." He reached up gently, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Someone who understands that our complexities, our in-between spaces, are not flaws to be hidden, but gifts to be shared." The fountain show reached its climax, water and light dancing together in a spectacular finale. But Magnus and Charisse remained focused on each other, recognizing in this moment something rare and precious, a connection built on shared understanding, on the courage to be vulnerable, on the willingness to see beyond surfaces to the truth beneath. "In architecture," Magnus said, his voice carrying quiet conviction, "we talk about load-bearing walls, the structures that carry the weight of everything built above them. But equally important are the openings, the windows and doors that let in light and allow connection. I think people are the same way. We need our strength, our protective walls, but we also need the courage to create openings, to let others see inside." His words resonated deeply with Charisse, echoing her own journey as an artist and a woman navigating multiple cultural identities. She thought about her digital pieces that explored themes of transparency and opacity, of revelation and concealment. "It's like my interactive installations," she replied thoughtfully. "The viewers think they're observing the art, but really, the art is revealing something about them, about how willing they are to look deeper, to engage with complexity, to see beyond their initial assumptions." Magnus nodded, understanding perfectly. "That's what drew me to your work initially. How it challenges viewers to question their perspectives, to engage with multiple layers of meaning, just like you challenged me tonight, invited me to see beyond surface appearances to something deeper." The gardens had grown quiet, most visitors having departed for the night. In this peaceful moment, surrounded by the beauty of cultivated nature and the distant hum of the Vegas Strip, they sat together in comfortable silence, each processing the depths of understanding they'd reached. "Thank you," Charisse said finally, "for sharing your story, for helping me understand that I'm not alone in navigating these spaces between worlds." Magnus's response was to draw her closer, his arm warm and secure around her shoulders. "We're all searching for someone who can see us clearly," he said softly. "Someone who understands that our complexity is not a flaw, but a gift." Above them, the desert stars shone with remarkable clarity, visible despite the city's endless lights. Like them, these celestial bodies existed in the space between Earth and infinity, between light and darkness, between what was and what could be. Chapter 12. Love's True Face. As midnight approached, Magnus led Charisse to the Bellagio's rooftop garden, their hands intertwined. The city lights sparkled below like a sea of stars, creating an intimate paradise high above the bustling strip. The night air carried the sweet fragrance of jasmine and desert sage, mirroring the unique blend of cultures they each embodied. Magnus drew her close, his touch gentle but filled with certainty. The moonlight painted silver highlights in Charisse's natural curls, and her eyes shone with an inner light that took his breath away. Here, surrounded by night-blooming flowers and the soft whisper of fountain mists, they found themselves in a moment of perfect understanding. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice husky with emotion as he cupped her face in his hands. "Not because of how you look now or how you looked earlier, but because of who you are. Your test didn't just reveal my character. It showed your bravery, your intelligence, and your heart." Charisse felt tears of joy threatening to fall as she saw the depth of love in his eyes. No masks separated them now. No walls stood between their hearts. She reached up to trace the strong line of his jaw, memorizing this perfect moment. Their lips met in a passionate kiss that seemed to stop time itself. It was a kiss that spoke of understanding, of acceptance, of two souls who had finally found their perfect match. Magnus pulled her closer, one hand tangled in her hair, while the other pressed against the small of her back, eliminating any space between them. Charisse melted into his embrace, her arms wrapping around his neck as the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more consuming. When they finally parted, breathless and glowing, the city lights seemed to dance just for them. Magnus rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cool night air. "Stay with me," he whispered, his words carrying the weight of promise, of passion, of a future filled with love and understanding. "Always," Charisse answered, drawing him down for another kiss that ignited their souls and sealed their destiny. That night marked the beginning of their epic love story, a tale of passion, understanding, and the triumph of authentic love over superficial appearances. Their hearts had recognized each other's truth. Their souls had found their missing half, and in each other's arms, they had discovered that true beauty lies in the courage to be vulnerable, and real love sees beyond all masks to the heart that beats beneath. Stop! Before you go any further, how will you find me in this huge world of fake channels? You might think they are Mr. Peter, but they are just using Al to clone my voice. Don't be fooled. Subscribe to my official channel and become part of this beautiful family. Let's stay together and keep the real stories alive.